Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to Cable Cross Apologetics. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And we're just at the very beginning. You're only missed an episode. So go back, watch that episode if you haven't already. And we're going over the book Christian Ethics, 4 Views, which is part of the Spectrum Multi-View book series that IVP has. They've got a good number of them. I'm liking it, and I kind of mash up all the books together with Zondervan's Counterpoint. And so we're not to the argument yet. So you haven't missed the main fight. And so we're just defining our terms for kind of the areas of different ethical frameworks that Christians have a history of pointing to as being their area of right and wrong, telling them kind of what path to take. And so we've covered 2 so far. We've covered the virtue ethics that is, I think it's our first one that'll kick off. And then we've also covered the natural law. And those are kind of the 2 kind of big ones that you might hear if you have studied in the area of ethical theory. And so from here, we're going to cover the last 2, which are the divine command theory and also the prophetic ethics theory. And so that might be a new one, and we'll see some, I think, familiar key terms within that. So we shouldn't discount anything yet. We're just defining our terms, and then we can fight about it after that. All right. Well, the divine command theory then is our third one that we're covering, and the editor talks about, and each of these goes through a definition, a short historical concept, and then a biblical basis for holding these. So that's what our author, or our editor, is doing here.
Right, and this divine command theory is the famous one that non-theist, atheists, and that sort of thing like to beat up on. This is the one that they jump on, and so he gives briefly ways that divine theorists attempt to defend the divine command theory. So we'll briefly see some of that as we go through this here.
Yeah, so it hasn't been knocked out of contention yet. Well, a divine command moralist is one who maintains that the content of morality, what is right and wrong, and good and evil, just and unjust, and the like, is directly and solely dependent on the commands and prohibitions of God. This definition rests on 3 critical pillars. So first, divine command theory starts with a volition rather than reason, that natural law does, or affection, that virtue ethics does, that God's commands are a product of the divine will. And correspondingly, the proper human response is obedience. Just obey. Just do the thing that you're told, and you'll live rightly. So you adjust your will to match God's will to these requirements. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar is that since these directives originate in God's will, that they may be opaque to reason and thus are known, or at least mostly clearly known, by revelation. It must be revealed to you. The law, the commands from Scripture, the letters being written to these people to do these good things so that you will live rightly. So those are the 2. And then the final pillar that divine command theory rests on is that since God is the sovereign being, no external standards determine what God's will or what God will or must command. Otherwise, such a standard imposed a limitation on God's freedom and power. And so we would turn to and say, well, if there's something that's waiting on God, why don't we turn to that and figure out what that standard is? So we can't take a step back further because God is the ultimate being, the big guy, the cheese at the top. And so there's nothing above him that requires him to do those things or make those commands or make those precepts to say, don't do these things. And so we know we can trace back the source to the originator of those.
Yeah. He says that once we digest the implications then of these 3 elements, we might anticipate that the divine command theory will draw, here it is, fire from critics, right, especially non-theists. And so at the center of these criticisms is what has come to be known as the Euthyphro dilemma.
Yeah.
And so a Christianized version of it asks something like this. Does God command the good because it is good, or does something become good because God commands it? Right. So notice we have two options, dilemma, right? And the reason they're dilemmas is because it seems like we only have these two options, and neither of these two options are good, at least in terms of what theists believe, right? The first option says that God's commands point to the good, which then implies that some moral standard exists independently of God. So here's the standard, and God has to look to the standard to determine what good is, right? Now, of course, this view is in tension with the divine command theory. The second option says that good things are good because God makes them so. So anything that God, decides at a whim becomes good, right? And this seems to make it possible for God to have made anything. Torturing children, right, seem to be the favorite example he tells us. Morally honorable. The arbitrariness problem, right? This is called the arbitrariness of the objection. And to drain the word good of meaning, right? The vacuity or emptiness problem, right? And so since good simply means God commanded, well, what is good? It's what God commands. Or what does God command? God commands good. And so we have kind of a circular, emptiness problem.
Right. And in our interview with Mitch Stokes, who wrote the book How to Be an Atheist, he actually tackles one of these horns for Euthro's dilemma, and says that the horn isn't as pointy as what Euthro makes it out to be. So yeah. I'll leave a link for that short clip in the description below. All right, so responses to these challenges usually take us to the metaphysics. Hey, we like the metaphysics. We're comfortable there.
And I think what he's looking at here is actually metaethics.
Oh, yes, metaethics.
Yeah.
Yes. So the things above that we're talking about, which studies ultimate ethical foundations. Divine command theorists note that common ethical ideas and activities become incoherent if we discover that they lack a trustworthy foundation. The foundation. That's a key phrase for us. For example, most individual theists and non-theists agree that keeping promises is a basic moral rule, and that this and other ethical principles are objective and obligatory rather than culturally dependent, optional, or invented. Advocates of divine command theory argue that without some transcendental foundation, it is difficult to envision an adequate and objective ground for the binding nature of these rules. And so, oh man, now so we're talking about foundations, we're talking about transcendence. Oh man, I don't know. I'm not trying to be swayed early, but they're using a lot of language I like here. And in contrast, Christianity's God, a sovereign, personal, and moral being, provides explanatory power for our senses of the universality of and obligation to moral rules.
Right. So the idea here is that when you begin to challenge the divine command theory, the theist kind of turns the argument around, right? How can we have ethics if there is no God? We have no foundation for ethics if, there is no person who gives us the values that we say that we want to have. And so that's one kind of way that the ethical theorists attempt to deal with it. He calls it the meta-ethical approach, right? He also, in this chapter, he also talks about Robert Adams' modified divine command theory. So notice, previously he defined the divine command theory as, God, the commands of God comes as a result of God's will. God just determines by his will what is morally good or morally bad. Well, what Robert Adams does in this modified divine theory, he argues that ethics is not grounded in God's commands per se, right? That is God's will, but in the divine character and God's gracious actions toward us. So Adams suggests that the source of the goodness is not arbitrarily whatever God
Right.
said, but the source is the character of God, who is love and is good, right? And
Mhm.
so, in this manner, Adams avoids the criticism that God's commands are arbitrary. And a loving God obviously would not command us to act cruelly, for instance, right? And so, if the source is in God's character, then you have a ground for it that's, is more foundational than just an arbitrary will, one might suggest. In fact, the notion of God just, his commands are based on his will is really closer to Islam than
Right.
Judeo-Christian belief,
Right.
right? And so what Adams does is he pulls us back to a Judeo-Christian foundation for the divine command theory. And it's the character of God, not the will of God, that's the foundation of it.
Mhm.
Since moral law then is a natural implication of an eternally loving God, we avoid the criticism that an external standard of goodness limits God's freedom. Moral goodness is God's nature and not something external to God. And so, God's sovereignty then remains intact, but its definition focuses more on love than freedom or coercive power.
Mhm. Right. Right. Because will can always change as well. The Muslim God can always say, "Listen, I'm even higher than the words I've given to you," and so I've changed everything from the Shahada to saying the Macarena if I want to. So it's just an expression of my will. There's nothing that you can do about it, and so this that regrounds it, but grounds it in I think a better way, and yeah. This is an kind of an interesting fork because when someone kind of gives you a dilemma, sometimes we get trapped in that mindset of I have to look at these two answers that are given to me when we can say, well, maybe it's not a dilemma actually, and that's what
It's a false
Adam says.
dilemma,
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
Which is a fallacy, right? If you're only given two answers, but there's more than two answers, then the dilemma is a false dilemma. And
Right.
so that's what Adams does here. Adams says, hey, wait a minute, there's a third position, right? It's not God's will that makes it arbitrary, nor is it goodness independent of God, which makes it superior to God, but it's based on God's character. And so there is he splits the horns of the dilemma.
Right. Right. When did you stop beating your wife?
Yeah.
There's more than two answers.
Yeah.
All right. So where does the biblical principle come into play? How are Christians able to hold this position and find it in Scripture? Well, in Genesis 2's creation account, the first word God addresses to humans is a command. You may freely eat of any tree in the garden, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in that day that you eat of it, you shall die. Scripture supplies a plethora of commands that originate from God. I mean, that's kind of what the Pentateuch is known for. And it's obvious that these directives are authoritative. They have consequences to a lot of them. Their purpose is to drive out the sin and drive in the people and the good. Divine command advocates also note that Scripture stresses obedience, like in Deuteronomy 4 or Leviticus 18 or Matthew 28, even without any guarantee that reason can grasp why God imposes particular obligations. And finally, divine command theorists point to that most Christians, when asked to identify the essence of Christian ethics, go directly to the Ten Commandments, all couched in imperatives.
All right, so that's kind of the Christian or the scriptural kind of support for this particular position. All right, well, let's move to the the fourth position. This is the last position that he wants us to see, and this one's kind of different than the rest of them. He calls it prophetic ethics. And he says, of the ethical paradigms in this volume, prophetic ethics may have the broadest range of expressions. However, several shared characteristics kind of set it apart. First, prophetic ethics, he tells us, finds its foundation in ecclesiology and mission rather than the divine attributes, like the divine command theory, or a vision of human flourishing, like natural law and virtue ethics.
Mm-hmm.
So this ecclesial model, he tells us, means that while the other models find their primary expression in individual ethics, right, telling me what I should do, although they're clearly applicable to social ethics, the starting point for prophetic ethics, he tells us, is social justice, which is underscored to be the visible reflection of the values of God's kingdom. Mm-hmm. So this one has to do with, our social responsibilities with regard to the world.
Right. All right. So what does that look like?
Yeah.
An additional characteristic of prophetic ethics is its emphasis on the corporate dimensions of sin. Forms of Christian ethics that focus attention on individual behaviors and decisions fall if they fail to recognize the principalities and powers, or organized systems established by the powerful who are the primary beneficiaries. And as a result of that, there are those outside the circle of social and economic powers are excluded and unheard.
Right. So now what we'll see as he continues to refine this definition is something, that's rather contemporary now.
Right.
Will come into view here, right? And so he further says, a final general characteristic of prophetic ethics is criticism of approaches that fix attention on theory and doctrine, while failing to engage the world on behalf of the silenced and the poor, right? So not a focus on theory and doctrine, but a focus on people who are silenced and who are, in poverty. So
you people in your ivory tower, that you just sit there and think and think and think, and oh yeah, how many angels dance on the head of a pin? I'm out here in the soup line giving to the poor.
Exactly. So he says, instead of grounding ethics on the theoretical foundation, some segments of prophetic ethics emphasize what he calls praxis, right? So that's kind of, practicing the principles, right?
In economics, and one of the economic theories that I've subscribed to, praxeology, the fact that people act with purpose. Now, it might be the correct purpose, but they act with a purpose. And so how people make decisions based on what they give their money to, or how they make decisions on economic theory. Once I saw the word praxis, I was like, hey, I've mentioned that a few times in this show too.
Yeah. And oftentimes Christians make the distinction between orthodoxy and orthopraxy.
Yeah. There you go.
Right teaching versus right practice, nice. Right? So that's the idea here. So the activity of the community, he's saying here, in constant conversation with the narrative that sustains the community. So the language of praxis, then, this practice, recognizes that social structures and traditions, embedded ways of life that transcend rational analysis, even determine what is considered rational. Thus, we're called, according to this particular approach, to immerse ourselves in the world through engagement and not, this distance ivory tower analysis.
Right. Well, the social gospel movement of the early 20th century vividly illustrates this. At the heart of the social gospel is an emphasis on the corporate dimension of sin. Thus, the social gospel moved from the church to the streets, often aligning itself with the labor movements and seeking the right to organize, better wages, and humane working conditions. It adopted populist political agendas, and many advocated Christian socialism as a necessary step towards economic justice. And again, we have this kind of contemporary idea of these things, and we say, in 2008, this thing just kind of reared its ugly head. No, actually, 20th century. I mean, the fact that Christianity didn't all be encompassed, at least in the West, to this social justice movement. Read your history about that era, and just realize just how prevalent that was, how focused it was, and the fact that we came away from it for a certain amount of time was a feat of miraculous intervention.
Yeah. And also, he says liberation theology retains the social gospel's concern for the poor and engagement with the social dimension of sin. but spreads in new directions. Liberationist thought transcends the social gospel's kind of North American context to encompass Latin America, feminism, African, Asia, and Black theologies, just to mention a few, he says. So liberation theology argues, as the name signifies, that the gospel message is one of liberation, right? And thus liberationists are critical of those who read the Exodus story, for instance, as deliverance from, bad habits and individual sins, while ignoring the physical, financial, and political enslavement experienced by the majority in the world yet today.
When leaving from Egypt, the Egyptians gave the exiting Jews a lot of gold to get out of there. So maybe their reparations can be their story of reparations can be used in ours. Yeah. So this is something that obviously has a big impact in our world today, for good or for bad. But here it's being used in an ethical framework here. All right, particularly critical in this process is a thorough re-examination of biblical interpretation, since the Bible was used in the colonial past not to only save, but also to civilize native peoples, and thus make legitimate the claims made by the colonizers that their dominance over the colonized was justified. Prophetic ethics frequently refers to Jubilee as a pivotal ethical passage in the Old Testament. The command that slaves are to be freed and all property returned to its original owners or heirs on the 50th year, as seen in Leviticus 25, is viewed as a model for erasing structural economic inequalities within the community. So all those dollars that I gave to the sporting events, if they just want to return them to me after such and such time, then I can't even tell you who plays baseball anymore. But those people that make 3 commas in their salary can go back to living like me for at least a good little amount of time.
That's right. So that's kind of the Old Testament support of he suggested anyway of this particular ethical approach. What about the New Testament? Excuse me. Well, it says in the New Testament, the words and activities of Jesus take central stage in prophetic ethics. In Matthew 25, 31 through 46, Jesus states that the standard by which we will be judged is determined by our response to those in need. Also, at the beginning of his ministry, Jesus closely ties his messianic identity to the prophetic message of justice and liberation and healing for the poor, captive, blind, and oppressed, right? As we see in Isaiah 61. And so he says, perhaps more than any other scriptural passage, however, prophetic ethics cites the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5 and Luke 6, and its message of hope and blessing for the persecuted and the dispossessed. And so those are kind of the scriptural support for this particular approach.
Right. And so I know you might be tempted to just dismiss that one as being the wacky one. But I think there's a lot of positives and a lot of valid argumentations that you can make. And if you say, oh, I don't care about any of that, well, then learning from it is a good way to combat it. So instead of just making fun of it and making memes from it, if you understand it and are able to respond to those points that it makes or implies or levies against you, then all the better, because then you're more informed. So,
of course, though, I'd like to see the memes, but anyway.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So, right. So, you take reparations from this area and then you just move it to the world and say, all right, now you have to give all your reparations to the areas that you colonized from 5,000 years ago.
So this gets us now to the end of this particular introduction to the book, right? We see these 4 different ethical theories, ethical approaches that he calls Christian ethics, right? Virtue ethics, natural law ethics, the divine command theory, and what he calls prophetic ethics here. And so now the rest of the book, what we will have is proponents of each of these particular, approaches, give their position and then respond to the other three folks' position. And so that's kind of the way this book is put together.
Right. So next time, we're going to kick it off with Brad Kallenberger. He's the virtue ethicist, and so he'll make his point. And what we'll probably do is we'll cover his section. That might be 1 or 2 episodes. And then from there, we'll try and fit all the responses into an episode. But depending on how much they talk, how much we talk, how much we talk about they talking or not talking enough, there'll be a couple episodes in there. So, we'll go at a normal pace, and hopefully this has sparked some interest that you see. Well, maybe you have your one that you want to pick, but the other sides make legitimate points as well. How best can we fit that into your model? Are there areas where we may need to shift focus and create a brand new version of natural, virtual, divine command theory? So we'll just mix them all together and be Americana in liberating ourselves from the shackles of the Greeks. All right, so that's what we'll do for next time. As always, short clips can be found on YouTube for all these things, to break it up and to kind of reassess different areas that you may need to focus on more. And they're just kind of fun, simple things to make and bring people in. And also caveofthecross.com, where you can check out all our previous books. We've done 10 books so far. We've got all our interviews up there. If you haven't had your book yet, now's the time to check the description, and you can find it there as well. You can find it on links to on different areas. Logos has it, of course. The Amazon River keeps giving us books, so you can order it through there as well. All right, so that's it for this episode, and so as always, we appreciate you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.